Right. Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Roy Magara, and I am an employment solicitor working at Magara Law. And you are very, very welcome to this. Hopefully, going to be a really interesting talk about race, discrimination, and mental health at work. I am really privileged and pleased to be joined by gracious Musariri, who I will pass on the baton to in a moment to introduce herself and tell you all who and what she's about in a moment. But a few bits of housekeeping beforehand. Firstly, please mute yourselves for now while the talk is going on, unless you are prompted to, for whatever reason, by us to interact. Secondly, please indeed use the chat box for Q&A, comments, feedback, etc. Belinda, you've kindly mentioned that the link for Eventbrite didn't work and you managed to get through in LinkedIn. So that's really helpful to know. I've sent out something via email to everyone, so they should get that in just a moment. And you're welcome to have your cameras on if you'd like. If you want to keep them off, equally, it's up to you too. But without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Gracious now to introduce herself.
Thanks, Roy. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today to talk about a very important topic, which is talking race, discrimination, and mental health. I am a mental health professional. I currently work within the NHS, registered mental health nurse, and also currently working as a project manager, working within workforce development. So one of my key areas of interest is mental health in the workplace. And recently, this year, I started my company, Empylo, which is essentially a community to bring people together to talk about mental health in the workplace and other issues such as diversity and inclusion, which may have an impact on mental health and well-being. So I'm just here to talk about something which I'm really passionate about within the workplace. And I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with you all today. Thanks, Roy.
Super. Thank you very much, Gracious. All right. Well, without further ado, let's dive in terms of what the discussion is all going to be about today. While you can all hopefully see the screen has changed on the slides, I want you all please to put into the chat box something which we'll then come back to a bit later on. But as many of you as can interact in this, the better. So can you please put in the chat box with the context being race? I am X, but I am not Y. So for example, it could be on the topic of race, I am a black man, but I am not a gangster, or something along those lines, or some kind of stereotype. It can be something from your own experience. It can be a stereotype which you may have come across, but it'll be really helpful if as many of you as possible can put into the chat box now your thoughts on that. And then again, I'll come on to that a bit later. But as you can see on the screen, this is what's going to be the focus point in terms of my discussion on equality, diversity, and race. So let's jump into equality and diversity. So on the face of it, these two terms seem to have a lot in common. Thank you very much. A couple of people have put in some things already there. So on the face of it, equality and diversity seem to have a lot to do in common already. And although people often discuss these terms interchangeably, their meanings are quite distinct. Equality and diversity, typically speaking, are essential tools to prevent discrimination and unfair dismissal or unfair treatment. That essentially is what the brunt of that ought to be. Now, in the workplace context, a workplace that values equality will actively try to identify and minimize those barriers that exclude people and take action to ensure an equal access to everyone in terms of work. A workplace that values diversity will recognize, value, and take account of people's different backgrounds and cultures, knowledge, skills, and use those experiences as assets to build a more productive and effective workplace. Thank you to those so far who are putting in some really interesting points here, and we'll touch on those in a bit later on, but please do keep them coming. So in short, equality is about making sure that everyone has the same chances and opportunities while recognizing differences. And the promotion of these two are really important. Now, anti-discrimination law on the subject of race is enshrined in a legislation called the Equality Act 2010. And that takes care of a number of types of discrimination. And I'm going to talk about some of these, and I'm actually going to share some cases in my own experience that I've come across. So the first is direct discrimination. And direct discrimination is usually where someone is penalized actively because of their race. For example, in one of my experiences, I won't necessarily say whether these cases are current or past, but one particular case that comes to mind is of a Black individual who didn't even last 2 days in the workplace because her colleagues, who had thought that this particular individual was out of the building at the time, had began calling the individual names like King Kong, the nutty professor, and so on, thinking that she was out of the building. That conversation happened outside the staff toilets. And coincidentally, the employee was in one of the cubicles and she heard everything. And suffice was quite upset and she left. Another example is where there's a national company, I can't mention who, but this national company, it turned out, was paying its employees of a certain European nationality significantly less than the main group of nationals, than the majority of nationals in that workplace. And my client, who eventually was successful in their claim, only found that there was this pay discrepancy after overhearing a conversation between managers. The second kind of discrimination is indirect discrimination. And that's where there is some kind of working arrangement in place that works well for everyone on the face of it, but actually it puts a certain set of individuals at a disadvantage. So again, in the context of race, this is where, for example, there's a client of mine who was disciplined because she was having a conversation with someone else and brought up something in her mother tongue, and that colleague complained, and she was disciplined by the employer because the employer said that that could potentially make other members of staff feel uncomfortable, which is a bit odd to me, really. Please do mute yourselves for now if you're not on mute already. Thank you. So the next kind of discrimination is harassment. And harassment is unwanted conduct which has to be related to a protected characteristic. And in this case, we're talking about race. And the effect of that conduct has to leave the individual feeling intimidated or degraded or humiliated or offended in some way. And this takes many forms. It can take the form of banter, say, for example, or some ill-fitted joke or teasing. An example, for example, is where there was a Caucasian individual who was told that they weren't able to act or say something in a particular way because they weren't like those of the majority race in the office. And the last example of discrimination under the Equality Act is something called victimization. And that's where an employee suffers something because they have sought to speak out, whether in an anti-racist manner or stand up for someone who has been at the brunt of an abuse of, in this case, racism in the workplace. So if you remember that King Kong comment case I was telling you guys about earlier, the other client is the person who was dismissed from her role because she stood up for the particular employee who was a victim. So unfortunately, it still happens. Let's move on to unconscious bias just for a moment here. So our brain is typically hardwired to distinguish between that which is familiar and that which is unfamiliar. It's a basic survival instinct that has typically kept human beings safe for thousands of years. Our brain typically splits people up into a kind of us and them box, and we all do it all the time and we can't help it. Whether it's religion, political association, smartly dressed, young, older, female, male, our brain typically, without us sometimes even realizing it, splits us up into an us and them box. Quick test, think about it. Think about this naturally yet concisely. What do you, I'm going to put it in the chat box, but just think about this to yourselves. What do such people look like to you? Or how do you feel about people who vote for the Liberal Democrats or vote for the Conservatives? People who like sports, people who like fast food, people who speak English, but don't speak English rather, but live in this country. Can you sort of feel your brain trying to sort these people out into groups or stereotypes or groups of categories in your mind. And some of us might have visual stereotypes already imprinted there. And our biases typically are formed by our upbringing, socialization, experiences, the media. So many different examples of just how our brain makes these kind of assessments about people. And in terms of us forming opinions about people, initial opinions about people, our brain takes 1/10 of a second to do that. And quick ask in the group of people here, and please just spend the next 10 seconds putting in the chat box. How long do people think it takes to make, to form an initial impression? To form a first impression of someone? How long does it take? Does someone put seconds? 3 seconds, 10 seconds? Okay, looks like most people are in the kind of seconds category. Yeah, okay. Depends on how quickly you process. Yeah, that's fair. All right, well, thank you everyone for doing so. 27 seconds. So disparity here, but most people are in the kind of realms section of time frame. Later studies suggest 7 seconds. So that means within 7 seconds of you all listening to me, looking at me, you've already formed your first impression. And anything that happens from that point is sort of you tinkering away at this sort of mold of Roy Magara you've got in your heads to form whatever your final view of me is going to be. So it's very interesting because we all have an unconscious bias and we all can't help it. And what I'm not saying in the context of race is that it's a bad thing. The whole purpose of these kind of short tests and Q&A is to get us all thinking about how our subconscious can affect our consciousness without us even realizing it. And hopefully it can help us form a better view in terms of our social interactions on the topic of race from this point on. So when we think about the extent and value of diversity in the workplace, if you think about those cases I talked about earlier, those are definitely examples of how not to do discussions on race and how not to treat people on the complete spectrum of the racial variety and background. The beautiful thing about when we embrace diversity, when we embrace racial discussions, is that it allows an organization typically to offer a wide range of skills and resources and ideas to give the business that typical competitive edge. So if you don't believe me, think about it on these sort of 2 top reasons. First is a business, when it embraces a positive discussion on race and equality and diversity, means that there's an opportunity for greater innovation and creativity. What do I mean by flying about all these keywords here? Well, quite simply put, effective problem solving often involves working with others. And if all those people have different experiences or backgrounds or cultures and educations, it naturally will lead to new and innovative ideas, which otherwise won't necessarily come up if everyone comes from the same stock. And secondly, from a business point of view, it leads to a better understanding of your customers or your clientele. So think about it. If you've got a more diverse workforce, you can market your business more effectively to different ethnic and racial backgrounds. And staff with similar backgrounds can then help you promote better understanding between your businesses and your different customers, as well as help keep your market share. And one thing I'll never forget was from a colleague of mine years and years ago who was from Japan. And we were talking about business cards, and he was talking about how actually in Japan, business cards seem to have much more significance in terms of value than they do here in the West. In Japan, he used to tell me that people you'd hand that over to them with both hands and you'd receive it with both. And there's a whole process to do with that, which I found completely fascinating. And that then means that whenever I meet another Japanese person, I always at least have in the back in my mind, okay, this may be the case at how this person may receive that. It just gives that better cultural understanding of one another, which is really important. And when we look at the effects of stereotyping, looking at on the other side of things, these facts and figures here from a survey were taken from the City of Mental Health Alliance, and it really shows how different people from different backgrounds feel. And hopefully you can all see on the screen there the various questions people may have been asked and their answers to them. And it's interesting when we go back to the sort of I am X, but I am not Y questions we talked about earlier. So some people have put, I am a Black woman, but not angry. I am Southeast Asian, but I'm not inferior. I am Black, but I'm not a bully. I am of Barbadian and Ghanaian heritage, but I am not passive. I am a South Asian woman, but I am not corrupt. I am an Asian Muslim hijab wearer, but I am not oppressed. I'm a Black man, but I'm not a thief. I wonder how many of these are based on experiences or things that people have been through, whether in the workplace or otherwise. From the study that was taken from the survey, which kind of brings the foundation of our discussion here, a lot of people felt that they had to censor the way that they truly were outside of work to someone who they thought they needed to be within work. And I thought that that was really quite an important thought process for us all. But when we embrace race and when we open the discussion up, the question is, how can businesses then help promote a healthy change? And before I pass on to Gracious, I'm going to mention these few points for us all to consider, whether manager, HR, or employee to consider. The first is that we can increase diversity at board level. So, for example, there are other areas where there's a lot of promotion of that, and it's great. For example, people talk about increasing the level of female diversity at board level. And the same ought to be taken for race when we look at some of those two top tips and examples of why that can be really important and helpful for businesses. The second, in terms of how businesses can promote a healthy change on this subject, is offering training and educational resources. There's plenty out there for us to consider. Next, give your employees from ethnic backgrounds opportunities to speak up. It is probably quite natural that they'll want to do it anonymously at first, but in terms of however you want to do things in your business, open that up for discussion, have an open forum, listen and actively engage with your employees about positive change, and have accountability as well, and be transparent. And the more that a business can see that there is some kind of audit process, there is a real desire for change within your recruitment processes, within your business processes, within the ways that businesses are trying to promote anti-racism and uphold inclusion, that's really important. And I think one thing that really stood out for me on this discussion was to ensure that racism isn't just about one particular race. And it also isn't about seeing, for example, Caucasian people as the oppressor and all the other minority ethnic, the ethnic minorities as the victims here. It's across the board, because what you don't want to do is have every discussion as, oh, well, it's just pointing the finger here. It's about inclusivity and bringing everyone together. That's what equality is about. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Gracious to talk about her subject area. Over to you.
Thank you, Roy. That's very interesting and compelling information there, especially just thinking, thank you for the exercise about kind of asking us to speak on who we are and, you know, the common perceptions that people might have of us and kind of challenging those. So thanks for that. I'm going to be speaking on mental health at work in relation to race and discrimination. So firstly, I'd just like to talk about the importance of mental health at work. I'll start with a simple kind of definition, which is from the WHO, World Health Organization, which talks about mental health being a psychological state that allows individuals to realize their abilities, to cope with normal stresses of life, and to work productively and make a contribution to their community. So I think it's important to talk about mental health not being the absence of suffering, but also being somewhat an opportunity or a way for someone to be thriving, whether in their workplace or whether in relationships, in the community, and physically as well. So when I look at mental health and think about mental health, I think of these five categories that we can see here. First one being emotional wellness, second one being social, mental, physical, and spiritual. So it'll be really interesting to know, because I think everyone has their kind of hierarchy and the way they categorize what's important to them. So if you don't mind just putting in the chat what you think is most important to you when it comes to these five kind of domains, it'll be really interesting to just get an understanding from people. So I'll quickly speak on emotional wellness, and this is essentially the ability to kind of handle your life's ups and downs. This is kind of regulating emotions, having emotional kind of stability. This is when difficult situations occur, whether you're at work or whether you're at home, being able to manage your emotions. When someone's emotional wellness is poor, this can be kind of exhibited as kind of lability in mood. Someone could be happy one moment and then really irritable the next moment. Another sign of poor emotional wellness is when someone is lashing out, whether at colleagues or customers, clients, whatever that may be. So in order to achieve emotional wellness, we need to also look after our mental well-being as a whole. And then we think about social wellness, and this is about building meaningful and trustworthy relationships. This can be in the workplace, at home, community, whatever that may be. The ability to offer support to others and to also be accepting and receiving of that support as well. And we also start to think about situations and issues such as financial wellness and being involved in the social wellness aspect. And then we think about mental health or mental wellness. And this is essentially beyond just looking at mental health as a whole, but looking at the mental state. In relation to the workplace, we can think of it as our ability to learn and use information. So when someone's mental wellness is poor, it may exhibit as someone not being able to concentrate, their productivity might decrease. You may not see them you may see them or observe them to be kind of dazing or kind of not appearing to be present in the moment. That's kind of a sign of poor mental well-being. So that's also important to consider when you think about mental health. And then we'll move on to physical. This is about balancing the causal relationship between our physical health and mental health. We all know that both of these two these two elements kind of rely on each other. In order for us to have good physical health, we need to have good mental health, vice versa. So in terms of our mental health impacting our physical health, we can think of it as our sleep. If someone's mental health is poor, their sleep will be impacted. Usually some people may end up sleeping longer and feeling that they need to sleep continuously, or they're not feeling like the sleep is actually helping. Also, they'll just continue sleeping for hours. Or it may also be that some people don't sleep at all, and they come to work, they're tired, and that also impacts their emotional well-being, being irritable. How mental health can impact our energy levels, our ability to kind of get up in the morning, our ability to do things, exercise, as well as our immune response. We all know that stress or prolonged stress can impact the levels of cortisol in our system, and that can effectively cause kind of our immune system to be impacted. And that means we're more susceptible to colds, common colds, flus, even other symptoms such as headaches and stomach aches. Okay, I'll just admit someone. And then also spiritual health, spiritual wellness. I think this is something that people sometimes often overlook when they think about mental health. I think this is very important, and it can mean different things to different people. Sometimes when people think spiritual health, they think religion. Some people think meditation, prayer, whatever it may be. Spirituality means different things to different people. However, it's really important and kind of fundamental in one's mental health and well-being. Spirituality provides direction and meaning in life. It allows us to grow, to be able to reflect on our experiences, and to also develop resilience when we're facing challenges and kind of difficult situations at work or at home. So I think all of these five together are really important to consider, and they all exhibit in different ways. If we're kind of looking out for someone who may be experiencing poor mental health or who may be impacted, we also look at all of these five areas, because there are ways to see and identify when someone is not well. And this can be for your colleagues, or whether you're a manager, supporting staff. It's important to consider these five elements. Okay, and then moving on to the next slide, Rory. Okay, and this is kind of two quotes from the Race, Discrimination and Mental Health, kind of the report, which was delivered by City Mental Health Alliance. I picked these two statements out specifically because they relate to mental health and well-being, and how racism and race discrimination can impact one's well-being. So as you can see in bold there, people who've experienced racism at work, 65% of Black people, 59% of Asian people, 48% of mixed race people surveyed, they reported that it negatively impacted their mental health and well-being to a very large or moderate extent. And also that research reveals that there's a clear negative impact on employees' mental well-being when they feel the pressure to change their behavior, whether they're in the workplace. So speaking on that, I'd just like to talk a little bit about the impacts of racism on mental health or race discrimination, whatever form that may come in. Okay, so we all know that racism has long-term kind of negative effects on mental health. This is because racism, as Roy has already mentioned, has the ability to disempower an individual and to also make them feel helpless. And this doesn't matter whether it's a big action or a small action, whether it's, you know, an act of violence towards someone, which is, you know, racial and discriminatory, or whether it's a comment or microaggression that's kind of passing. It can leave someone feeling very helpless and kind of disempowered, and also lead to other long-term mental health effects. So I'll just speak on kind of the common immediate emotional responses to racism, and that's kind of fear and anxiety, shock and disbelief, anger, shame, sadness, hopelessness, and a feeling of being disconnected as well, which can also lead to loneliness and social isolation. And then you have some more long-term effects of racism, which can be prolonged stress, anxiety, depression, and racial trauma. And all of these can manifest in different ways for different people. And some people may experience racism and may be able to be more resilient, and other people may feel that, you know, it can completely change and impact them and their ability to go to work and kind of continue with daily activities. It just depends on what the person's mental state and emotional state is at the time, and, you know, even other reasons, what else may be going on in their lives as well. But what's important to understand is that racism can have a negative, and often does have a negative impact on people's well-being. So I did speak about racial trauma, and I wanted to just highlight that a little bit more, and how that manifests as it's kind of an emerging health condition, which kind of is being realized as we kind of do more research into the relationship between racism and mental health. And some of the kind of symptoms or the manifestations of racial trauma is kind of re-experiencing a distressing event. And this can be an event that's happened to yourself or that has happened to someone else. And I'll just go back to kind of the last 12, 18 months. As we all know, the story and the situation of George Floyd being being killed, in that situation. That can have lasting effects on people, whether they were there, whether they experienced it, or whether they just observed it from watching the news or reading about what happened. That can have some kind of trauma on somebody. And then it also has somatic symptoms, which can be kind of headaches, as we go again, thinking about the relationship between the physical and mental health. We think about headaches and raised heart rate, stomach cramps. Someone may feel physically ill because of the trauma related to an experience of racism. It also causes hypervigilance, someone feeling on edge and unable to settle, becoming more anxious essentially. And then avoidance as well, someone not being able to or feeling comfortable to go out in certain situations, or perhaps in the workplace, someone may have something to say, but because of a previous experience of racism or discrimination, they'll want to avoid being in situations where they speak up or they talk about how they're feeling because of concerns of how people might perceive them, or worry that, you know, it may lead to further racial discrimination. And these are experiences which are faced by people on a daily basis throughout their lifetime, whether they're at work or in the wider community. And I think it's just important to kind of identify when these people are experiencing these things, and to be able to approach people and just kind of speak to people openly about this, to kind of understand their experiences, or whether, you know, if there's a colleague who's from a different, you know, ethnic group, it's important to maybe have conversations and understand how racism has impacted them, because I'm sure everyone has a story, whether it's, you know, whether it's a story from their experience or an experience that someone else has had and they know and understand. I think it's important to have these conversations. And moving on, we also know that individuals from minority groups are less likely to openly speak about their mental health, yet we see how they might be more vulnerable to poor mental health due to these experiences. So we'll move on to the next slide of just starting to think about how we can approach this as an organization and as individuals. So I've kind of put together the inclusive workplace mental health system slide. This is essentially looking at how organizations or teams and individuals can implement mental well-being strategies or systems and resources within their organization, which are inclusive and address equality issues. So the first one, the reason I put it into these 4 categories is because there's some research done by Nielsen and Dr. Ogmunaya, which looks at workplace resources and thinking how they can be promoted at 4 levels. So you have the individual level, the group and team level, the leadership level, and the organizational level. I kind of follow this in terms of my consultations and in my kind of way of thinking about mental well-being in the workplace, because it allows the onus to be on everybody. I think sometimes people often feel that mental health is their own responsibility, that they don't have to kind of talk about it at work, or that they should just keep it to themselves. But I think looking at it as an organizational model, or looking at it at these 4 levels, encourages everyone to think about mental health at, you know, as a manager or as a leader or as a teammate or as a colleague and as an individual as well. Okay. So the first one of the individual kind of resources that I've thought about is culturally specific coaching. I think it's important within organizations to have coaching. This can be for well-being generally or professional development. I think when we think about culturally specific coaching, is about bringing in people or buddying people with coaches who are culturally competent and who do understand different cultures. I think sometimes often people may have a perception of a specific culture but may overlook certain things. So when we're thinking about coaching or implementing some sort of coaching and mentoring within organizations, we need to think about, do we understand the different cultures that are within our organization, and can we represent everybody who is within the organization? And then we think about self-directed learning, and that's essentially about encouraging employees to set aside time, whether it's 1 hour per week, to kind of focus on their mental well-being and also focus on engaging in conversations about mental health or reading up, developing a skill which may kind of improve their mental well-being, whatever that may be, but giving employees and colleagues time to do that and allowing them to have that time that's designated purely for self-development and mental well-being. And then we also have some online resources. There are apps which are culturally specific. There are common apps such as Headspace, which is a great app for meditation, if anyone is interested in that. And there's also Liberate, which is a culturally specific app. It's a therapy app for minority ethnic groups. So that's called Liberate, and it kind of explores racial discrimination and the impact on mental health as well, and kind of looks at meditation from a cultural perspective as well. And then we think about group and team. We encourage group reflective sessions, which is essentially getting people together as a team, discussing a topic. This can be facilitated or not facilitated. I often find that facilitated sessions are better because it kind of allows the conversation to be to flow and to be structured to some degree, and to really probe on issues which are important at that time. Group reflective sessions have been proven to be really effective in terms of allowing people to kind of freely speak and to feel to be open to speaking to their colleagues and to their managers and whoever it may be within their organization about things which are really important to them or their experiences that they may be having within the workplace. So we do encourage group reflective sessions. This can be once in a while, getting people together, having a facilitator who can come in and ask the right questions or make some probes so that people can start thinking about issues such as race, discrimination, as well as mental health and well-being in the workplace. And then when I talk about meeting agenda, it's about bringing in whether it's weekly team meetings, whatever that may be, bringing in diversity and putting that on the meeting agenda and having a conversation as a team. It doesn't have to be structured. It doesn't have to be a very kind of in-depth conversation. It can be just an open space to talk about these issues. And this can be about diversity, this can be about inclusion, it can be about mental health as well. And just bringing that space into the team meeting, just to allow people to feel free and open to talk about these issues. And then we think about leadership, and then we look at storytelling. Storytelling for me is quite a big one. I think we'll look at it as personal storytelling. In traditions across many cultures, including African and Asian cultures, storytelling has been used as a way of kind of bringing people together. This can be adapted in the workplace as leaders kind of sharing stories with their colleagues. This can be whether this can be talks, blogs, newsletters, one-to-one supervisions with colleagues, and just sharing experiences of maybe an experience of when they've had poor mental health in their lives, or when they've had a challenging situation that they've not known how to manage or kind of deal with, and how they've kind of overcome that. Sharing that story allows people to empathize and allows people to feel more open to speaking about these issues within the workplace. And seeing that from a leadership stance, it kind of encourages people to be more open and to want to speak up and talk about these issues, which are really important. And then training for leaders and managers. There are many trainings that leaders and managers can engage in, to better understand how to manage and support employees' mental well-being, and also to understand about diversity as well. I think these are really important issues, and that training will be helpful in doing that, because sometimes managers don't feel equipped. That's what we see often in the workplace, that leaders and managers don't feel that they've got the experience to be able to speak to someone about their mental health, or they don't feel that they can, or that they can say the right things. So training is just a way of equipping people and preparing managers to have those conversations and to be able to identify those issues, like we said in the first kind of slide, talking about the different manifestations of poor mental health. And then also speaking on organizations and organizational kind of perspective, I talk about the feedback loop, and this is essentially looking at data and assessing and measuring psychological well-being and in the workplace, and also looking at kind of inclusion, diversity and equality as well in doing that. So one thing I would suggest is kind of sending out surveys or questionnaires on a regular basis, asking the questions that things that you want to understand about equality, diversity and inclusion within your particular organization. Also to understand about mental health and well-being and people's perspectives on this. And then being able to use that information that we get from whether it's surveys or focus groups, and being able to use that information to understand the barriers and the enablers within your particular organization, and then doing something to address those issues, whether it's bringing in people for training, whether it's running the reflective group sessions, or including diversity and inclusion on the meeting agenda, whatever that may be. And then reassessing again after a particular period of time to see whether there has been any change, or whether people have found these kind of initiatives to be useful, and then publishing your findings. I think it's really important for organizations to be transparent and to openly speak about what they're doing in terms of equality, diversity and inclusion, as well as mental health and well-being, and kind of making that information accessible to your colleagues and to your any stakeholders that may be within your organization. And then also last is leveraging on communications. This is using internal communication channels to kind of raise awareness and normalize conversations about mental health and diversity and inclusion. So whether it's a monthly newsletter, including mental health and including equality, diversity and inclusion in those kind of monthly newsletters that may go out, also running a forum or creating a forum for staff to speak openly, whether anonymously or whether they want to kind of be open about what their experiences may be, or even just make suggestions and raise concerns that may be going on in the organization, using communications to really kind of distribute information and to keep the conversation going. Because I think oftentimes when people feel that their organization supports conversations about mental health and well-being, as well as equality and diversity, I think people feel more encouraged to speak up and to kind of be open as well, and to kind of address, they feel supported as well, and that their organization understands and want to support them. So that's essentially it, in terms of kind of thinking about inclusive workplace wellbeing systems. And thank you for your comments as well in terms of what you value in terms of your physical, in terms of your mental health. Some people have said they value kind of emotional health. That's kind of at the top of their kind of hierarchy. Some people have said mental and emotional. Some people have said physical. I think it's important to realize how all of these interconnect, and to think about, if you notice your physical health declining, try and think about, perhaps, is it related to my mental well-being? Or if you notice a colleague is a bit more kind of reserved, or kind of isolating themselves and they're not talking as much as they normally do, try to think about, could this be related to an experience that they're having with their mental health and well-being? So all of those conversations can start just by observing, being more observant of kind of colleagues within the organization, and also thinking about mental health beyond just someone kind of presenting as, you know, really unwell. Someone can just present as, you know, distanced, whatever it may be. Those are little signs that we just should be looking out for. But that's essentially it from me, and thank you, Roy, for giving me the space to speak.
Thank you very much, Gracious, for that. Lots of really practical tips, really, for us all to think about taking care of ourselves and taking care of others. So thank you. We're now going to enter the Q&A/comments section of the webinar. You're welcome to unmute yourself if you've got something to share or a question to ask, or put something in the chat box, perhaps. If you want to turn your cameras on, that's completely up to you. If you want to keep them off, again, completely up to you. That's completely fine. Someone's asked if we can share the webinar PowerPoint file. Yes, I can do that. I'll send out the slides and a recording of the webinar as well. While everyone is warming up, I actually have a couple of questions which came in directly to me. One of them is, how long does it typically take if I need to bring a claim against an employer for racial discrimination? The basic answer is, from whenever that last act is, that last conduct issue is, there's typically 3 months minus a day to bring a claim. And the way that's initiated is you start with an organization called ACAS, ACAS. And you start with ACAS, who are a sort of mediatory organization. And if you can settle through that, wonderful. But if not, then they'll issue you with a certain certificate and a number, and you then use that to progress toward the employment tribunal. But in the most basic of terms, it is 3 months minus a day. And then the other question I had was, what if the issue is concerning race and discrimination is my line manager? Who do I speak to? Well, typically, if the line manager, who usually ought to be your first port of call, if there's such an issue, then I recommend having a confidential conversation with HR and explore avenues that way. That would be my suggestion there. So I'm going to open the floor now to everyone in terms of your own questions or comments.
I've got a question, please.
Thank you, Olua. You're welcome.
I think there's still stigma things around mental health at work, and discussing things like race in the workplace. And I'm pretty sure that there's a number of good practices out there that especially you, Roy, or Gracious might have come across in the workplace, where they've managed to break down the barriers around these somewhat, well, or as perceived, so-called uncomfortable conversations. Are there any that you've come across? Because I think a lot of people do want to talk about these things, but maybe don't feel comfortable, and maybe employers can better help and assist to facilitate such discussions.
Thank you. Great question. Gracious, over to you.
Fine. Thanks, Olua, for a great question. And yes, so some of the examples or suggestions that I gave in the final slide, That's based off of kind of also observing some kind of useful and effective kind of approaches within organizations. So the meeting agenda, that was something that I found to be very effective in one organization. People were encouraged to kind of bring mental health discussions about mental health to the platform during team meetings. I think initially it was difficult for people because these aren't kind of conversations that people feel free to talk about within a meeting or kind of team situation. But again, speaking from leadership perspective, having someone who encourages people to talk about these kind of issues, whether it's mental health, equality and diversity, people started to kind of feel more open to speaking about these issues, and it was found to be quite effective, kind of bringing it into a meeting kind of situation, and also communications as well. Like I said, encouraging people to kind of speak about or think about mental health and well-being, as well as diversity and inclusion, by kind of sharing comms on a regular basis. That just makes people feel more comfortable to kind of bring it to the platform, because they see that their organization is doing something and that the organization recognizes that mental health is a priority. They recognize that equality, diversity, and inclusion, there are priorities. So I think those are the two kind of ways to kind of leverage on, you know, discussions about mental health and well-being, and encouraging employees and colleagues to just feel more comfortable to start the conversation. Does that answer your question, or?
Yes, thank you. It's great to be reminded of that. I do have one follow-up for both of you again, please, if that's okay. Sorry. Is this a quick one?
Yeah.
May I? Thank you. So as it's being referred to, race report issued by the government a couple of months ago, was released, lots of conversations around that. But, you know, in that report, regardless of the various views, there were still a couple of recommendations for addressing racial discrimination and mental health related issues in the workplace. Do either of you have thoughts on those recommendations?
Thank you for that. Really good point. And yes, I think that particular report received a lot of media attention, and in many ways rightly so. I think one of the main things that need to be done is that it needs to be very much an employer-led conversation. We're already in a status quo where the research shows that employees of these particular backgrounds are less likely to come forward and start bringing on their views. It's less likely for someone to say in an employment forum, oh, by the way, manager, I am X, but I am not Y. And this person brought that up, because they already feel they've got to act differently in the workplace. But as Gracious mentioned on the subject of mental health and ways that employers can assist with that, I think the same thing goes when it comes to talking about race and equality in the workplace. Now, I think one of the recommendations from the report was, for example, okay, let's just hire lots more of ethnic people. Well, you can't just, okay, let's just hire Black people, let's just hire Asian people, let's just hire the whoever, because when you look at things from that spectrum, you then remove the banner of what it actually means to have an equal and diverse workforce, where you have two people who are applying for a job. It, in the same breath, is not just simply right to hire someone purely on the basis of race as opposed to someone else. And that's equally the wrong way around to go about things. But I think one thing that can certainly assist in terms of that recruitment process is fine, looking at that workforce. And a legal way, a lawful way, is where you have two people who are of the same kind of level, qualification, etc. A business may take the view actually to increase our diverse quota. We will hire someone on the topic of race who is of a particular race in order for us to bring in a more diverse workforce. The law allows for that. But what the law does not allow for, and what employers ought not to do, is simply to have a kind of blanket, we're simply going to recruit this particular race or these particular races on the exclusion of all others. Does that brief thought assist? I know that there's plenty to talk about that, but does that help?
Indeed, that was very helpful. Thank you.
Sure thing. Just a quick turn to the chat box before anyone else wants to mute themselves. Someone's asked if people will receive a copy of the recording. Yes, All those who've given their email addresses who have, as part of the Eventbrite sign up, yep, certainly you'll receive them. If for whatever reason you haven't or you're not sure, you're welcome to send me an email. My email's on the screen now, and I'll make sure you get a copy of that. Or indeed, anyone else who you think may benefit from a copy of that or the slide, you're welcome to send that across as well. Someone has asked, I think this is one for you, Gracious, may I know what's the most important to you among the emotional, mental, social, physical, and spiritual banners you had up earlier?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think for me, it starts with physical. I believe that if I'm able to kind of look after my physical well-being, then everything else kind of merges together and balances together in terms of my mental well-being. So I careful about what I eat, being careful about getting enough sleep, and also just kind of taking care of my general physical well-being, and that definitely has an impact on my overall well-being. So they balance together, but the ultimate would be kind of starting with the foundation of good physical well-being and will allow me to, or enable me to achieve my best or optimum well-being, mental well-being. So yeah, that would be most important to me. And then it would probably go up to mental well-being, spiritual, emotional, and then social as well.
Thank you, Gracious. I'll open up the floor again. If anyone wants to unmute themselves, and if you've got anything to say or ask, you're certainly welcome to.
I think someone had asked about the app. So yes, Olua had answered, yeah, Liberate is the name of their app, which is for ethnic minority groups. And yeah, that's spelled correctly. And also Headspace, as you may know, is kind of a meditation app that you can access. And there's also Unmind, which is also available. I think it's free to use. For some elements of it are free to use, and then other parts you have to subscribe, or you can also get it through your workplace, depending on whether your workplace has subscribed to it. So those are also all three are very good and useful apps that you can use for mental well-being.
Thank you kindly. Unmute yourselves at will if you'd like, but I'm just going to go back to the chat box as I've got a few questions in, both directly and otherwise. Someone's asked, what evidence can be adduced to prove mental health loss due to racial discrimination at the workplace? I think, Gracious, you're best suited on this one. I'll pass on to you for that.
Okay, I'm happy to share some evidence or some information in an email, because I do have kind of a collection of resources. So if that would be really helpful, please do share your email address and I can just share that out. I don't know if Roy, it will be easier for you to share it.
Yeah, quite right. You're welcome to send it over to me, and then when I send out all the information, I'll ping that across too. Okay, thank you for that.
No, Richard's name.
Someone else asked in terms of some EDI websites. I'll also put that into the email as well. So there's going to be a fairly long and packed email, which is good, but that's absolutely fine. Someone else asked about what is the difference between equity and equality. I think I pointed out earlier in terms of the difference between equality and diversity. Equity, typically speaking, is very much more, equity rather is about what is fair. So treating people fairly in the workplace. And that, I suppose, in its sort of maybe more root form, boils down to the Equality Act, which then deals with how do we treat people fairly and equally, and making sure that one person isn't trumped over the other. So equity has got a bit more of a larger scope, but equality, at least from a legal point of view, has got to do with something called a protected characteristic under the Equality Act. And for the purpose, at least for this discussion, race is caught in that. So some people are putting in their email addresses into the chat box. You're very welcome to. Please also email me your well, if you email me, then I'll get your email address. But the email addresses too, please, just in case for whatever reason your emails are kind of lost in the thread, as it were, of the chat box as well. Anyone else got anything to unmute yourself and ask before I go back to the chat box? We've got a few more things coming in.
Yeah, Alexandra did say, did you happen to watch Green Book? It was about racism and discrimination, and it enlightened me on the severity of racism and discrimination, just sharing. Thank you, Alexandra, for sharing that. That's really helpful. I think we can also add that to the email, perhaps, so that people may kind of look for that film. Is it a film, I'm assuming? I think that'll be really good to add to the email, Roy, so people can access that as well.
Sure thing. Super. Thank you very much, Alexandra, for that. Okay, I think I saw another question. Let's see. Someone has asked, let's see, from my experience, the challenges of addressing racial discrimination if perceived, indirect rather than direct, proper evidence, and how this might hold people back from claiming. Really good question. And discrimination typically is, in the majority sense in the workplace, is usually much more difficult to catch and to hold out rather than maybe other types of discrimination. From an indirect discrimination point of view, or even from a direct, typically it's people often come with, I've just got a sense, I've got a feeling. It actually happens that when we had this team meeting, my manager spoke to everyone in a very friendly tone, but when the manager came to me, the tone was completely different, or everyone else seemed to have gotten a raise, but I haven't. So-and-so was trumped over this. The other day I had a phone call from someone who said to me that he, along with 3 others in his business, had applied for a job role. He was the most experienced of the 3, and he happened to be a Black in terms of his ethnicity. And he and his 2 other colleagues had applied somewhere for the 3 posts. His 2 other colleagues who were Caucasian got the role, and he didn't get the role, even though he was more experienced than the rest of them and only had positive feedback from them. Upon challenging the prospective employer, his thought process was that they gave just some kind of vague, or something wrong with our pro forma form, and that's why we didn't give you the role. Oh, but would you like the role now? And to him, even though he was offered the role, so in one way one could see that as a remedy, to him that wasn't good enough. He still felt that something was off, and had he not raised something about it, that would have just been brushed over. To him, it was very much more about race or something else underlying than anything else. So I suppose the reality is sometimes it is quite difficult to underpin something. It's rare you have something like that King Kong case I told you about earlier. But that's only a short answer I'd give to you. I hope that helps. We'll ping on this last question, just conscious of time. So someone's asked, if leaders are not actively making changes in the workplace in relation to anti-racism, how can we keep anti-racism at the forefront? Great question. Gracia, shall I leave you with that one?
Yeah, no, I'd say it's a very good question. I think it's important to, with most organizations, they tend to be a race equality network of some sort, or some kind of group or network where people can come together and talk about these issues. I think that's a good way to get together with people who have the same view. And I think it's important to not only include people from minority ethnic backgrounds, but also bring in people as allies who are from other backgrounds, whether it's a white background or minority ethnic backgrounds, everyone to come together with these equality networks and to push it. You know, whether it's writing to the leaders within the organizations, setting up events, whatever it may be. I think it's good to come together as a network of some sort or as a community, and kind of just push that forward, because sometimes there may be resistance within organizations, but when people come together and they're able to show that this is something that's important, and I speak on allyship as well, because I think that's also very important to support as well, whether you're not even if you're not from an ethnic minority background, it's still important to be able to show your allyship and support for race equality within the workplace. So I would encourage bringing in or working with or joining a network within your organization if there isn't one already, and perhaps start one. It can be as simple as a WhatsApp group or a Slack channel, that kind of thing. So yeah, starting that conversation and, you know, bringing in like-minded people to push that forward.
Super. Thank you very much, Gracious. All right. really, really thankful to all of you for your participation, for you joining in. It's been really great to have you all. Thank you so much for taking part in the discussion. And I hope you've all gleaned something in some way, shape or form from this. Really want to continue that with you. Our details are on the screen, so you're welcome to take them. For those of you who've left your email addresses either on the Eventbrite sign-up form or within the chat box, I'll get them all. We'll make sure we get this recording, the slides, and all these other bits of information that you've all asked for as well. So thank you all very much for your contributions. It's goodbye from Gracious.
Thank you all. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you. And it's goodbye from me. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.